Farmer Joe hammered the last nail into the Scarecrow's wooden arm. He smiled, pleased with his work. This Scarecrow was perfect to protect his cornfield from hungry crows. It stood tall and menacing in the middle of the field, its straw-stuffed body covered in old overalls and a tattered coat. Its painted eyes seemed to stare into the distance. Joe went inside, feeling safe knowing his crops were guarded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the Scarecrow's eyes followed him. He shrugged it off as his imagination. It was just a scarecrow after all. The next morning, Joe went out to check on his fields. He stopped short, a shiver running down his spine. The Scarecrow's head was tilted at a different angle. Had it always been like that? He walked closer, examining the Scarecrow. Its arms seemed to hang lower, too. Joe told himself it was probably the wind. He straightened the Scarecrow's head and went about his work. Over the next few days, Joe noticed more changes in the Scarecrow's posture. Each morning it seemed to be leaning a little more, its arms dangling closer to the ground. The unsettling feeling in Joe's stomach grew stronger. It was as if the Scarecrow was slowly collapsing in on itself. One particularly windy morning, Joe found the Scarecrow lying face down in the dirt. He sighed, deciding it was time to build a sturdier support for it. As he picked it up, he noticed something strange. There were deep grooves in the ground where the Scarecrow's feet had been. It was as if it had been dragging its feet, trying to move. Fear pricked at Joe. What was going on? Joe couldn't shake off the image of the grooves in the dirt. It was as if something heavy had been dragging itself across the field. He decided to investigate further, examining the ground around his house. His heart pounded in his chest when he saw them. Footprints. Large, muddy footprints leading from the direction of the cornfield, stopping right at his back door. Fear turned his blood to ice. These were no animal tracks. He rushed inside, bolting the door behind him. Who or what had been lurking around his house? The Scarecrow's menacing presence in the field suddenly felt much closer, much more threatening. Joe couldn't sleep that night. He tossed and turned, the image of the footprints seared into his mind. He had to know what was going on. He decided to set up a camera. He spent the next day rigging up a security camera, pointing it directly at the Scarecrow in the field. He hid the monitor in his living room, the screen illuminating his worried face. He would catch whatever was happening, he would have proof. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the field, Joe settled down in front of the monitor. He waited, his eyes glued to the screen, his hand gripping a heavy iron poker. The hours ticked by, but nothing happened. Maybe it had just been a wild animal, he thought, trying to calm his nerves. Just as Joe was about to give up and head to bed, he saw it. Movement. At first it was just a slight tremor in the Scarecrow's body, then slowly it began to turn its head. Joe held his breath, his eyes wide with disbelief and fear. The Scarecrow was moving on its own. It twisted its body with a sickening crunch, its head turning towards the camera as if it knew it was being watched. It took a step, then another, each movement stiff and unnatural, but undeniably deliberate. Joe watched in horror as the Scarecrow, his Scarecrow, lumbered off into the darkness beyond the camera's view. He was frozen in place, his mind struggling to process what he had just witnessed. The next night, Joe sat in the darkness of his living room, his eyes fixed on the monitor. He had boarded up his windows, reinforced his doors, and placed the iron poker within arm's reach. He felt a knot of dread in his stomach, a sense of impending doom he couldn't shake off. As darkness enveloped the farm, he heard it, a soft rustling sound outside his window. He held his breath, listening intently. The rustling grew louder, accompanied by a gentle tapping against the glass. He inched closer to the window, his heart pounding in his chest. A pale, shadowy figure loomed outside, its outline barely visible in the moonlight. It was the Scarecrow. It had come for him. Panic surged through Joe. He stumbled back from the window, his mind racing. He had to get out of the house, get away from this thing. He ran to the back door, fumbling with the locks in his haste, but it was too late. He heard the front door splinter and crack under immense force. Heavy footsteps thudded across the floorboards, each step sending shivers down his spine. He was trapped. He turned, his back against the door, the iron poker trembling in his hand. He couldn't see it, but he could feel its presence, cold and menacing, closing in on him in the darkness. A low, guttural voice echoed through the house, sending chills down Joe's spine. "There you are," it rasped, each word laden with a chilling malice that seemed to suck the air from his lungs. "Why do you keep running?" The lights flickered and died, plunging the house into darkness. Joe stood frozen in terror, his eyes frantically searching the shadows for any sign of his pursuer. He gripped the iron poker tighter, his knuckles white. He could hear the creature moving closer, the sound of straw brushing against the floor growing louder with each passing second. A wave of despair washed over him. He was cornered, with nowhere left to run. Then he saw it. Two glowing embers emerged from the darkness, moving towards him with an unnatural grace. They were the Scarecrow's eyes, burning with a malevolent light that seemed to pierce through Joe's very soul. "Why?" the creature rasped, its voice closer now, sending shivers down Joe's spine. "Why do you keep running from me?" Joe wanted to scream, to run, to fight back. But he was paralyzed with fear, his body refusing to obey his commands. He could only watch in horror as the Scarecrow, his creation, his nightmare, loomed over him, its shadow engulfing him in its chilling embrace.